What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the Lost Tangent Outpost. My name is Spada, and welcome back to the Multiverses Living Roster, a roster prediction that's entirely built by the community here on this channel. Throughout today's video, I'll be providing you with 5 CW shows that might end up being represented in Multiverses at launch, and I'll be asking you to vote in one of 2 polls as to which you think is most likely. Make sure to subscribe to the channel to make sure that you're a part of this community for future episodes and to see the results of today's. That I'm doing an episode focused on the CW might earn some audible groans from some of you, and frankly, I do understand why, and mostly I agree, but there have easily been some shows that could qualify to appear in a game like Multiverses. One in particular is the whole reason I'm making this episode, but we'll get to that here in a minute. Before we can talk about today's topic, let's go ahead and discuss the results of last week's poll and get the roster updated. So last week I asked you all which WB-owned sitcom you thought was most likely to make it into Multiverses. I knew while I was writing the script to the episode that there would be some opposition to that episode, because Multiverses is a platform fighting game, which means combat is inherently a necessary component, and sitcom characters don't tend to do too much combat. But in order to justify my speculation that they might get into the game, I went through great lengths to explain how I thought each property could be incorporated. I didn't have any expectations for where the vote would go. Given that my audience skews in the 18 to 34 age range, I thought that there was a pretty decent chance that a lot of you wouldn't even have heard of these characters, but I am pleasantly surprised because the response to the last episode was really good. Here are the results to last week's poll. I totally didn't expect to see Urkel and Sheldon get so much love, but I am pleasantly surprised to see so many of you not only know about these characters but are also fans. Despite how surprised I am by that, the show with the most votes was The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. I'm not hugely surprised by this, but I am excited. So let's go ahead and get The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air into the living roster right away. I gotta say, I'm really liking how this is looking so far. There's a good amount of representation between all of the families of products that WB offers, and I think that all of these characters would make super exciting and fun additions to the game. But as you can see, we only have one more slot left in our living roster to complete the 24 character launch roster. There are several more families of properties for us to discuss. We have a lot of movies that I think are still very likely. I still want to discuss Hanna-Barbera cartoons and other Looney Tunes, so no matter what the results are of this episode, we are not done. But in order to really do justice to the characters that we all think will make it into the game or that we all think are likely, we'll need to consider expanding the number of characters that we include in our living roster. In the meantime though, this last slot is going to go to a show from the CW. I'm aware of the reputation the CW has, and I generally mostly agree with that perspective of the channel. However, anyone that's been a part of this community for a long time or that knows me personally knows that my favorite show of all time is Supernatural, and there's no way in hell I'm going to let the opportunity pass me up to get my favorite TV character into this roster. For those of you who don't know, I'm talking about Dean Winchester. I fucking love this character, but before we can get into all of that, let's go ahead and discuss the 5 shows that we'll be discussing today. Obviously, one of them is Supernatural, but there are others that fit the bill really nicely. There's the crime drama Riverdale, which has seen a rise in popularity over the course of the last several years, and then there's the sci-fi action drama The 100, a show that my wife and I watched religiously up to the 4th season. We're also going to be talking about Izombie, a show about a superhero self-aware zombie, and then there's Vampire Diaries, a show that I know very little about, but seems to follow a teenage girl and her relationship with some local vampires she meets after a car accident kills both her parents. In either case, I think all 5 of these shows could have representatives incorporated into Multiverses quite nicely. They all have some amount of fighting and use some amount of technology or magic. I also want to preface this part of the episode by saying a few of these shows do seem to have split ownership between WB and CBS Viacom, which could very well affect the ability for them to be used in Multiverses. As such, it's worth knowing that these shows are The 100, Riverdale, and Vampire Diaries. I do not know for sure how these 3 shows' ownership is distributed and who gets the rights to make decisions, or if it has to be agreed upon. I simply don't know, but given that WB has at least some ownership of these characters, it shouldn't be outside the realm of reason. Having said that, it appears that Supernatural and Izombie are wholly owned by Warner Brothers, so these 2 shouldn't have an issue. Let's start this off by talking about the show with probably the least amount of fighting, Riverdale. Now, full transparency, this is not a show that I've watched. I've seen slivers of the show because my wife watches it, but I've never actually sat down to watch a full episode. That said, the show is insanely popular, even if I'm not sure why, but it also has its roots tied to an old comic, Archie. Now, it does appear that the comic is hugely different from the show in that it includes superheroes and stuff like that, but even the show Riverdale seems to have originally been planned to have ties to the chilling adventures of Sabrina, which I believe incorporates magic into that show. So it looks like there may be some supernatural elements, but as far as I know, it's mostly just a teenage crime drama, which is super dope for those of you that are into it. Now, given I know so little about the show, I guess the best character I can predict for it would be Archie, since it seems like he may be the main character. My wife tells me he actually does get into fights, and he's the one in the show that's most often to do so. And apparently he's a boxer, and I think that'd be pretty dope to have a boxer archetype in the game. And then I guess I'll try to cover these shows in order of my familiarity. So with Riverdale out of the way, that means next up is Vampire Diaries. As I mentioned earlier, the show starts out about a teenager who loses her parents and falls in with a group of much older vampires. Now, full transparency, I've seen more of this show doing research for this episode than I ever have before, so I know almost nothing about it. But it was a fairly long-running CW show and spawned, I think, at least 2 spin-off series. Now, the show starts out one way, but in the research I'm doing, it seems like the main character does seem to become one of the vampires, Damon. In my search for fight scenes from the show, more show up with him in them than anybody else, and he always seems to win. He shows incredible speed and agility, clearly has some amount of super strength, and clearly has plenty of combat experience. It seems that he would play as a close combat specialist, so you'd probably have to classify him as a brawler, tank, or assassin, but since we're sorely lacking in assassins and tanks in the game, I would go one of those two directions with him. Then there's Izombie. I watched a few episodes of this when it aired in the beginning. I started it because it was said to be based off of a series owned by DC, and then I kind of fell off because nothing in the first two episodes really hooked me. But it had a decent following, and doing some research in the show, I could totally see why. Liv, the main character, is insanely likable, and she seems like she puts a lot of effort into growing as a character and as a fighter throughout the show, and given that everything I can find puts her fighting up close in close quarters, I'd imagine she'd have to be something along the lines of an assassin. She seems to like to sneak around a lot in the show. She also seems to have a rage mode that she enters in the show from time to time, where she becomes a lot stronger and zombie-like, at least as the show portrays zombies. But I think you could make the case for her as a brawler or tank as well, and since the game is sorely lacking female representation, I think having someone like Liv would be really interesting. Okay, and before we get to my favorite, let's talk about the 100. This is a surprisingly super fun show. It's got a lot of action, suspense, murder, mystery stuff, and all kinds of interesting twists. I went into it not really knowing what to expect, but my wife and I quickly got addicted to it. Then we binged it until we caught up, watched a season as it was released, and then we fell off. There's just too many shows on TV these days. But anyways, the show has action and suspense front and center, so it's easy to adapt this show's characters into a fighting game. And there's such breadth in each character's style that you can make a full-fledged fighting game just based off of this one show. But if we're gonna go with the representative mentality, the character we've got to pick to represent the show is the main character, Clark Griffin. She's smart, agile, strong, and she's got a badass look to her. She's really the cornerstone of the show because she's the one person up to season 4 that brings all the different perspectives into one place. She is the show's uniter. I think she'd be an awesome character for this kind of game. Give her some tribal weapons to reference the first couple seasons, and then give her some gun projectile attacks to reference the later seasons, and you've got a really well-rounded character. And to go with the character archetype from the show, I think you could make her a support class. It's also possible, given how tough she's shown to be throughout the show, that she could be made as a tank. Alright, and we finally arrived. Now it's time for me to talk about Supernatural. Now I could gush about this show all day. As I mentioned, it is my personal favorite television show of all time. It would take me a crazy amount of time to try and explain all the reasons I love this show, but let me just try to stay on why I think a character from this show could make it into Multiverses. So there are a lot of different characters in the show, and a lot of them do like to fight, but you can't have the show represented without the Winchesters. You have to have Sam and/or Dean. Now, you could do both of them at the same time, I guess, but I think you have to have them as separate characters. But I'm not ballsy enough to predict both, nor am I lucky enough to get both characters in the game at the same time, or at least not at launch, so it's gotta be just one. Both of them actually do have very different tool sets when you look at the show as a whole and all the abilities that they learn throughout the show and weapons that they tend to wield. So that means that you really can't just costume swap them, though I know that's what a lot of people are thinking that they would do. So I'm personally hoping for Dean for the obvious reason that he's my favorite, but I'd be willing to give it to Sam if enough of you can convince me that he's the better choice. In either case, Dean is the hard-headed, stubborn badass of the show. He loves pie and hamburgers. So putting him on screen with Shaggy throwing sandwiches and Bugs Bunny throwing pies could have some really fun dialogues take place. But beyond that, as far as moves, I think you have to make Dean a mage. While they do tend to fight up close plenty in the show, you can't tell me, assuming that you're a fan of the show, when you think of Dean, you don't immediately imagine him with his Colt, or at least a shotgun. You might need to give him some melee options with an Angel Blade, or maybe even the first blade from the Kane season of the show, but I think most of the combat can be done from a distance. He could drop an Archangel trap for crowd control, place Salt around him for him and his teammate to act as a barrier, summon out Crowley and/or Castiel to aid in combat. So many options are available for him. And look, Sam has just as good a case that could be made for him, but I don't have time to go crazy, and because I'm biased, I'm gonna focus on Dean. So sorry to all the Sam fans out there. Alright, anyway, so with that, which CW show do you think is most likely to get represented in Multiverses? Riverdale, Vampire Diaries, Izombie, The 100, or Supernatural? You can either vote by going to the channel's community page. This week's poll will be at the top of that page. While you're there, don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. And if you'd rather, you can go to the Strawpoll website where I've created a custom poll. The link to this can be found in the description of this video and pinned to the top of the comment section. Look, I genuinely think all the characters that we talked about today bring something unique to the table, and I'd really be excited to play any of them. I do have a clear bias here, but don't let that influence you. Vote on whatever character you think is most likely. I really would like to see all of them. Thank you all for hanging out with me today. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments down below. Make sure to subscribe, like, and all that stuff. Until next time, later.